Ma'am, unless you're planning on hiking through 3 feet of Canadian snow in canvas sneakers, you're on the wrong midnight bus. Lauren Taylor froze halfway down the dimly lit aisle of the vibrating coach. Water dripping from the hem of her cheap winter coat straight onto a man's polished leather boots. The bus had already pulled away into the freezing mountain storm, its heavy folding doors sealed shut against the black highway. She clutched a torn paper ticket in her trembling, blue-tipped fingers, her heart hammering against her ribs, as 30 exhausted passengers turned their heads to watch her panic in the dark cabin. At 26, Lauren had spent her last $40 just to escape a 3-year engagement that had reduced her confidence to ashes. In her exhausted, grief-numbed mind, this overnight express was supposed to take her 500 miles south to the warm Atlantic coast, far away from a fianc who treated her dreams like embarrassing hobbies. Instead, the tall stranger in the charcoal wool coat picked up her dropped boarding slip, looked straight into her red, tear-filled eyes, and calmly showed her the single stamped word that destroyed her entire plan: northbound. Lauren stared down at the faded black ink stamped across the crumpled paper stub, her breath catching painfully in her dry throat as the cold reality of her mistake hit her like an icy wave. The central departure concourse had been absolute chaos under the freezing November rain. Gate announcement boards were flickering erratically with delayed mountain routes. Thick diesel exhaust drifted through the open garage bays. Crying children clung to exhausted parents, and distorted loudspeakers echoed conflicting boarding calls across the wet concrete floors. In her panicked rush to vanish before Julian could track her location through shared banking apps, show up at her studio door with empty rehearsed apologies, or call her family with calculated lies, she had run toward Gate 84 instead of Platform 48. She had walked straight onto an overnight coach heading deep into the sub-zero northern wilderness, carrying no proper winter gear, no return fare, and nowhere safe to stay. The man in the charcoal coat quietly shifted his heavy leather briefcase from the seat to the floor beneath his knees, making room for her without a single trace of judgment, condescension, or annoyance. Carl Mercer was 32, a partner in a growing sustainable timber architecture studio, heading back north after an exhausting 3-day municipal council dispute over historic preservation laws in the state capital. He was deeply composed, observant, and carried a quiet, grounded patience that felt remarkably stabilizing amidst the noisy, drafty commuter cabin. He watched Lauren gently from the corner of his vision, noticing the damp watercolor stains on her canvas tote, the heavy shadows of sleeplessness under her eyes, her trembling blue-tinged fingers, and the raw vulnerability that she was trying so desperately to conceal from the staring passengers in the dimly lit rows. Lauren sank heavily onto the squeaking vinyl seat, resting her temple against the freezing glass as torrential sleet rattled violently against the window panes with continuous force. She shut her eyes and tried to force her racing heart to slow down, but the worn metal zipper on her overloaded cardboard suitcase finally gave way under the pressure, bursting open with a sharp snap and scattering tubes of dried watercolor, charcoal pencils, a torn sketchbook, and a single bright yellow knitted wool sock straight into Carl's lap. Lauren gasped in absolute horror, burying her burning face in her freezing hands, completely unaware that the stranger's gentle, dry wit was about to pull her out of the darkest panic of her life. Carl looked down at the bright yellow sock resting against his tailored dark trousers, then carefully lifted it between his index finger and thumb with the solemn reverence of a museum curator handling an ancient, priceless artifact. "I've seen quite a few aggressive travel strategies on overnight commuter coaches," he murmured with deadpan gravity, "but deploying tactical knitwear to claim the entire row is certainly the boldest move I've witnessed this year." A small, wet, and completely involuntary laugh escaped Lauren's throat, despite the heavy knot of grief in her chest. As she reached out to snatch the sock back, Carl calmly knelt down in the narrow aisle, and gathered her rolling charcoal pencils, placing each one neatly into her open palm, without making her feel clumsy, foolish, or burdensome in front of the watching crowd. The heavy coach suddenly shuddered with violent force, its pneumatic brakes screaming against the flooded asphalt as the vehicle skidded sideways before coming to a dead stop on the steep mountain incline. Outside, torrential rain turned into thick freezing slush, while bright red emergency hazard lights from a long line of stalled logging trucks illuminated the dense, dripping pine forest along the ridge. The driver turned on the overhead fluorescent lights, rubbed his tired neck, and announced through the static speaker that a severe mudslide and a collapsed power line had completely severed the northern pass, forcing an immediate overnight detour to the only roadside diner within 40 miles. Frustrated groans echoed through the cabin as tired passengers stood up to grab their backpacks and heavy coats, grumbling about delayed business meetings, lost hotel reservations, and ruined morning schedules. Lauren sat frozen in her seat, clutching her taped suitcase and staring in sheer panic as her cracked phone screen flashed a red battery warning icon before completely dying at 4%. Carl stood up, smoothed his charcoal wool coat, picked up her heavy canvas tote with effortless strength, and looked down at her with steady, calm determination. Sitting alone in a dark bus won't fix the highway or recharge your phone, Miss Taylor. Let's get a cup of hot coffee and figure out a sensible plan together before the temperature drops any further. The roadside diner was warm, weathered, and humming with quiet comfort, smelling of dark roasted coffee beans, grilled sourdough, melting butter, and wet wool drying near the cast iron radiator. An elderly woman named Martha worked steadily behind the long laminate counter, sliding thick ceramic mugs and plates of homemade hash browns across the surface with maternal efficiency and a welcoming nod to each cold traveler. Carl guided Lauren toward a secluded booth tucked away in the back corner, ordering 2 large coffees, a plate of warm apple pie with cinnamon, and a bowl of hot vegetable soup without asking her for a single cent. Lauren sat stiffly on the cracked vinyl bench, wrapping her chilled fingers tightly around the heavy ceramic mug as thick white steam rose between them. For several long minutes, a comfortable silence settled over the table while the mountain storm rattled the heavy plate glass windows outside with relentless wind. Carl opened his vintage leather satchel, pulling out a brass fountain pen and a large grid notebook, deliberately giving her time to compose herself without feeling pressured to explain her misery or justify her tears to a complete stranger. Lauren watched the rhythmic, steady movement of his hand across the paper, feeling the tight, defensive knot in her chest begin to unravel in the quiet, judgment-free space. Slowly, her voice trembling like dry autumn leaves, she began to talk about why she was running away in the middle of a blizzard with $40 in cash. She told him how 3 years of engagement to Julian had systematically eroded her confidence until she felt like an unwanted ghost in her own apartment. Julian had constantly mocked her dream of illustrating children's books, calling her artwork a childish distraction, and demanding she abandon her classes to become a decorative, quiet accessory for his corporate dinner parties. Carl listened with complete attention, never offering dismissive cliches or patronizing advice, his warm hazel eyes reflecting deep, respectful understanding of her silent grief. Just as Lauren took a sip of hot coffee to steady her voice, Carl noticed a detailed pencil drawing peeking from the open pocket of her bag that caused his hand to freeze in midair. The exposed page revealed an intricate hand-drafted blueprint of an old stone bridge, drawn with the exact traditional cross-hatching and perspective methods Carl had mastered during his early apprenticeship in timber framing. Lauren quickly shoved the paper back inside, her cheeks flushing bright crimson with self-consciousness. "I studied classical architectural drawing before switching to picture books," she explained in a quiet murmur. "My father was an independent timber carpenter who built barns in Vermont." He taught me to see character, integrity, and history in the grain of reclaimed wood. Before he passed away when I was 16, Carl set his fountain pen on the table, a look of profound, genuine recognition, softening his sharp jawline. He reached deep into his interior coat pocket and pulled out an old, heavy brass plumb bob suspended by a piece of weathered cotton string that had belonged to his family for decades. My grandfather was a wooden boat builder who crafted small fishing dories on the coast of Maine, Carl said softly, letting the brass weight rest in the center of his open palm. When I started my firm, every investor pressured me to build cheap steel cubes, but I refused. Real timber breathes with the families who live inside it, carrying their stories across generations, the shared lineage of craftsmanship, honest labor, and quiet respect hung between them like a roaring fire, dissolving the distance between two strangers stranded on a forgotten mountain road. For the first time in 3 years, Lauren felt completely seen, valued and understood for the exact qualities Julian had tried so hard to erase from her spirit. Just as a genuine, beautiful smile touched her face for the first time that night, the heavy rotary phone mounted near. The diner cash register began ringing loudly, and Martha shouted across the room that the state police had an urgent update regarding the morning roads. The state trooper on the line confirmed that the main highway would remain completely shut down until late morning, but an empty Southern relief shuttle would pass by the diner at daybreak to collect passengers heading toward the Central Railway hub. Lauren let out a shaky, trembling breath, realizing that her temporary sanctuary with Carl would soon disappear into the morning light. Carl looked at her pale, weary face, then stood up, walked over to the counter, and quietly paid Martha for 2 thick wool blankets from the back storage closet, along with a fresh pot of coffee, 2 slices of toast, and extra sandwiches packed in brown paper for the journey ahead. Returning to the corner booth, Carl gently draped a thick red wool blanket over Lauren's shivering shoulders, tucking it securely behind her back with unhurried care. He turned to a clean page in his architectural notebook and placed it right in the center of the table between them, laying down an assortment of sharpened graphite pencils. Since we have 4 hours before the relief coach arrives, let's design a sanctuary together, he said softly, sketching the clean structural outline of a timber-framed gabled library. Lauren blinked back tears of surprise, her fingers tentatively picking up a dark pencil as the warmth of the blanket wrapped around her. Side by side under the warm glow of the diner lamp, they began drawing together on the wide paper, seamlessly combining his strong structural beams with her whimsical illustrations of arched reading windows, mossy stone hearths, hidden spiral staircases, and climbing ivy along the wooden walls. For several uninterrupted hours, Lauren forgot the bitter humiliation of her broken engagement, the freezing rain outside, and the fear of an uncertain future, completely immersed in the magic of shared creative work. As she leaned forward to shade the corner of the roof, Carl noticed a tiny, faded blue tattoo peeking out from beneath the frayed cuff of her mustard sweater. The small ink mark on Lauren's inner wrist was a minimalist and finished compass rose. Sensing his curiosity, she turned her wrist slightly toward the diner lamp. My father drew this exact compass on a diner napkin before his final construction job, she said with quiet vulnerability. He told me that getting lost isn't a failure of character. It's simply life making room for a far better destination. I spent 3 miserable years ignoring his lesson, forcing myself to fit into a mold that wasn't mine just to avoid being abandoned by someone who never truly loved me. Carl listened in deep stillness, the steady hum of the neon clock filling the quiet diner booth as rain continued to tap against the roof. He reached into his pocket and turned his grandfather's brass plumb bob between his fingers, his voice dropping to an honest, intimate register. When my mother passed away 10 years ago, I threw myself into 16-hour workdays designing glass towers for people who didn't care about anything but money, Carl admitted with a quiet sigh. I thought staying endlessly busy would protect me from the silence in my chest. It took me a long time to realize that isolating yourself behind an expensive wall isn't the same thing as finding real peace with your own grief. Around 4:30 in the morning, the heavy fatigue of the long night finally overtook Lauren's defenses. Her head drifted sideways, resting gently against Carl's broad shoulder as deep, restful sleep claimed her weary body. Carl remained perfectly still against the vinyl seat for over an hour, barely breathing so he wouldn't disturb her hard-won rest beneath the warm diner lights. When the first pale rays of sunrise began filtering through the mist-covered pine branches, a loud air horn blasted from the gravel parking lot, signaling the sudden arrival of the Southern Connection coach. Lauren jolted awake in a panic as Martha called out that the relief shuttle would only wait 3 minutes before departing for the city terminal. In the frantic rush of half-asleep travelers gathering coats and luggage, Lauren hurriedly gathered her scattered art supplies and secured her broken suitcase with a yellow packing twine. Carl helped her into her forest green coat, carefully adjusting the thick plum scarf around her neck to protect her from the biting mountain frost blowing through the open diner door. They stood together on the gravel beside the idling bus steps, the crisp morning air clear and cold under the rising golden sun that washed over the snow-dusted mountains. For several seconds, neither of them knew how to bridge the sudden gap between the intimate safety of the diner booth and the harsh daylight of the real world. Lauren looked up into Carl's calm hazel eyes, her fingers brushing his charcoal coat with profound gratitude. "Thank you for picking up my yellow sock," she whispered with a soft, trembling smile, "and for reminding me that I didn't fail at being an artist and that I'm allowed to take up space." Carl stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and gently cupped her cold cheek in his warm palm before leaning down to kiss her softly on the lips. The kiss was brief, tender, and tasted of diner coffee, cold mountain air, and the heartbreaking ache of a goodbye that had arrived far too quickly. As the bus driver shouted for final boarding, Lauren pulled away reluctantly and ran up the metal steps, completely unaware that in the morning chaos, her vintage tan sketchbook remained sitting on the wooden table behind them. 3 long months passed as the bitter autumn turned into early winter. Lauren had settled into a tiny studio apartment above a quiet corner bakery in the coastal city, slowly rebuilding her independent life by illustrating educational flashcards, painting botanical prints, and teaching weekend art classes to local children. Every night before turning out the lamp, she looked at the empty wooden shelf beside her easel, aching over the frantic departure that had separated her from her father's cherished drawings and the quiet, dry-witted architect whose kindness had given her the courage to breathe again. Meanwhile, 500 miles away, Carl had spent weeks searching through regional art directories, state illustrator guilds, and local community center registries. But with only the first name Lauren and a handful of unsigned sketches, every search ended in silence. He kept her tan sketchbook safely inside the top drawer of his drafting desk, opening its worn pages every evening to study her whimsical woodland animals in delicate floral borders. Whenever his corporate clients demanded cold, lifeless commercial designs, Carl looked at her sketches, remembering the warm glow of the mountain diner, the smell of cedar, and the sound of her laughter across the laminate booth. In late November, Carl's architecture firm completed its flagship community project, the complete historical timber restoration of the Greenfield Public Library, featuring an expansive vaulted reading hall dedicated entirely to children's literature. On the morning of the formal press preview, the head librarian led Carl through the bright mezzanine to inspect the final artistic installations. As Carl stepped onto the polished white oak floorboards, he froze in absolute astonishment, standing atop a low wooden ladder, painting the final golden leaves onto a massive woodland mural, was Lauren. Lauren turned around with a fine watercolor brush held between her paint-dusted fingers, her green eyes widening in complete shock as she saw Carl standing directly beneath the high timber beams. He was wearing the exact same tailored charcoal coat, holding her worn tan sketchbook against his chest with both hands. The background chatter of librarians, photographers, and city officials faded into complete silence as their eyes locked across the sunlit hall. Slowly, carefully, Lauren stepped down from the wooden ladder, her heart pounding with the exact same fierce intensity as that rainy midnight on the mountain bus. Carl walked across the wide oak floorboards, stopping a few feet away with a soft, unmistakable smile curving his lips. "I believe this sketchbook belongs to a master illustrator who knows exactly how to build a sanctuary," he said quietly, his voice steady, rich, and filled with emotion. Lauren took the weathered book with trembling fingers, tears spilling over her lashes as she turned to the final page and saw the detailed timber library they had designed together in the diner booth. "You kept every single line," she whispered, her voice breaking with overwhelming relief as she pressed the book against her heart. Carl reached inside his coat pocket and brought out her original paper bus ticket for Route 84, carefully preserved inside a clean protective sleeve with a pencil note she had scribbled before falling asleep. "Wrong bus, right person." He took her free hand in his warm grip, stepping close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of cedar and roasted coffee. "Getting on that wrong bus was the only decision in my life that truly mattered," Carl confessed with deep tenderness. Lauren let out a joyful, tearful laugh, throwing her arms around his neck as they embraced tightly beneath the warm vaulted roof they had dreamed up together in the middle of a storm.
When we experience prolonged emotional rejection or emotional neglect, the human mind develops an instinctive defense mechanism. We retreat into hyper-independence, convinced that staying in total control is the only way to avoid being hurt again. We force ourselves to stay in suffocating relationships or shrink our true personalities, simply because the pain of the familiar feels safer than the terror of the unknown. Yet, deep emotional healing rarely happens through careful calculations or rigid schedules. More often, profound human growth begins at the precise moment our carefully planned routes collapse, forcing us into situations where our defenses must drop to accept help from the world around us. Lauren spent years believing she was inadequate because an insecure partner lacked the emotional capacity to appreciate her creative spirit, while Carl hid behind professional overwork to avoid confronting the lingering grief of his past. Their accidental meeting in the middle of a mountain storm reveals a vital psychological truth. Sometimes ending up on the wrong road is the only way life can strip away our emotional armor and guide us toward genuine belonging. When we finally stop frantically controlling every outcome, we create room for people who will cherish the very parts of ourselves we were told to hide. Looking back on your own journey, was there ever an unexpected detour, a missed opportunity, or a terrible mistake that initially felt like a complete disaster, but eventually led you to the greatest blessing or relationship of your entire life? I would truly love to read your personal reflections in the comments below. If these quiet stories of kindness, emotional healing, and unexpected grace brought peace to your day, please take a moment to subscribe so you never miss another journey of hope.